Picture this. Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. The city wakes to a morning like any other. Palm trees swaying in the winter breeze, the Pacific fog rolling inland, the dream factories of Hollywood already humming with ambition. But in a vacant lot in Leimert Park, something waits in the grass that will shatter the illusion forever. A young woman lies there, impossibly still, her body arranged with surgical precision. She is not merely dead. She has been transformed into something else, a message, a warning, a work of terrible art that no one can decipher. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Short, 22 years old. Dark hair, blue eyes, porcelain skin that earned her a nickname she never knew she had. The Black Dahlia. She came to California like thousands before her, chasing the golden promise of stardom beneath the California sun. But Hollywood in 1947 was not the kingdom of dreams the postcards promised. Beneath the glittering marquees and studio lots, beneath the carefully constructed glamour, something hungry prowled the shadows. Something that understood the difference between a woman and a commodity, between fame and oblivion. The investigation that followed would become one of the most extensive in American history. 10,000 interviews, 750 suspects, more than 60 confessions from people desperate to claim credit for the brutality. Yet the killer remained a ghost, dissolving into the California haze like smoke from a cigarette. 79 years later, the case remains unsolved. Not because the truth was hidden, but because in 1947, Hollywood, truth, and illusion had become impossible to separate. The Black Dahlia was not just a murder. It was the moment America glimpsed the darkness beneath its own reflection. Picture this. Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. It is 10:15 in the morning, and the sun hangs pale in a winter sky that promises nothing. The air is cold for California, 58 degrees, and a thin fog clings to the vacant lots and empty streets of Leimert Park, a middle-class neighborhood where dreams of suburban respectability are still being built from the ground up. Betty Bersinger is walking with her 3-year-old daughter. They are heading to a shoe repair shop a few blocks away, a simple errand on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The street is quiet, lined with modest homes and patches of undeveloped land waiting to be transformed into someone's version of the American dream. This is the Los Angeles of the post-war years. A city swollen with veterans and dreamers, with factory workers and starlets, all drawn westward by the magnetic pull of sunshine and second chances. But as Betty walks along Norton Avenue, something catches her eye in one of the vacant lots. At first, she thinks it is a mannequin, discarded in the weeds. The shape is too pale, too perfectly still to be real. Perhaps it is a department store dummy, thrown away after the holiday season, left to bleach in the California sun. She moves closer, pulling her daughter along, curious about this strange object lying in the grass. Then she sees it clearly, and in that moment, everything changes. This is not a mannequin. This is a woman, a young woman, her body posed with impossible precision in the dead winter grass. Her arms are raised above her head, her legs spread slightly, her face turned toward the sky with an expression that Betty will never forget. The woman has been cut in half at the waist, severed with surgical exactness, the two halves separated by several inches of empty air. Her skin is waxy white, drained of every drop of blood, scrubbed so clean it seems to glow against the brown earth. Betty Bersinger does not scream. She cannot. Her throat closes, her mind refuses to process what her eyes are showing her. She grabs her daughter and runs, not to the nearest house, but to a house several blocks away, as if distance could erase what she has just witnessed. When she finally finds the words, when she finally convinces someone to call the police. She will describe what she saw as the most horrible thing I have ever seen in my life. The Los Angeles Police Department receives the call at 10:25 in the morning. Officers respond within minutes, thinking perhaps it is a prank call, or maybe a drunken vagrant who has collapsed in the lot. What they find instead is a crime scene unlike anything they have encountered. The woman in the grass has not merely been killed. She has been transformed. Her body turned into a canvas for something that speaks of rage and precision, of madness and control, of hatred so profound it required hours to express. Within an hour, the vacant lot on Norton Avenue becomes a circus. Reporters arrive before the coroner, their cameras clicking and flashing as they capture images that will soon appear in newspapers across America. Police officers string up ropes to hold back the growing crowd of neighbors and curiosity seekers. Homicide detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown arrive to take command of what will become the most infamous unsolved case in Los Angeles history. They stand over the body, trying to understand what they are looking at, trying to find words for the impossible. The woman appears to be in her early 20s. She has dark hair, pale skin, and features that suggest she was beautiful in life. But death has stolen more than her breath. It has stolen her humanity, reducing her to an object, a puzzle, a mystery that will consume thousands of hours of police work and yield nothing but frustration. Her body bears marks that speak of torture. Rope burns on her wrists and ankles, bruises along her arms, cuts that seem almost decorative in their placement. And her face has been altered with cuts at the corners of her mouth, creating a grotesque smile that extends from ear to ear. The detectives search for identification, but find nothing. No purse, no wallet, no jewelry. The killer has taken everything that might have told them who she was. She lies there nameless, a Jane Doe in the City of Angels, a ghost without a past. The only clue to her identity will come later, from fingerprints that match a set taken years ago when she applied for a job at an army base. But in this moment, standing over her body in the cold January morning, the detectives know only one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever did this is still out there, walking the same streets, breathing the same air. Los Angeles in 1947 is a city caught between two worlds. The war is over, and the boys have come home to find a California transformed by defense contracts and mass migration. The population has exploded, doubling in less than a decade, and the city sprawls outward in all directions, consuming farmland and orange groves and turning them into subdivisions with names like Paradise and Dreamland. Downtown, the movie palaces still shine with Art Deco grandeur, their marquees promising escape into worlds of romance and adventure. In Hollywood, the studios churn out films at an industrial pace, manufacturing dreams for a nation desperate to forget the nightmares of war. But beneath the glamour, something else is growing. The city's infrastructure cannot keep pace with its population. Neighborhoods spring up overnight without adequate police protection or city services. Crime rises steadily. Robberies, assaults, murders that go unsolved because the department is overwhelmed and understaffed. The newspapers fill their pages with stories of violence and corruption, of gangsters and crooked politicians, of young women who come to Hollywood seeking stardom and disappear into the shadows. Los Angeles is becoming something new, a place where the boundary between dream and nightmare grows thinner every day. And now, on this cold January morning, that boundary has been crossed in the most spectacular way possible. The woman in the vacant lot is not just another murder victim. She is a symbol of something larger, something the city has been trying not to see. She represents the price of ambition, the cost of illusion, the darkness that lives at the heart of the dream factory. Her death will expose fault lines in the city's carefully constructed image, revealing a Los Angeles that is not sunny and optimistic, but cold and predatory, a place where young women are disposable, where violence lurks beneath every smile. By noon, the body has been removed to the county morgue, but the vacant lot remains a crime scene. Police officers comb through the grass and dirt, searching for evidence that will lead them to a killer. They find cigarette butts, a cement sack, some tire tracks in the soil. They take photographs from every angle, measurements of every mark and wound. They interview neighbors who saw nothing, heard nothing, who slept peacefully through the night, while something unspeakable happened just blocks away. The investigation is already becoming the largest in Los Angeles history, and it has barely begun. As the sun climbs higher in the sky and the fog burns away, leaving the lot exposed and raw in the afternoon light, one question hangs over everything. Who was she? Until they can answer that, until they can give her back her name and her story, she will remain what the killer made her. A mystery, a spectacle, a body without an identity. But the answer is already on its way, traveling through the bureaucratic channels of fingerprint identification. Soon the detectives will know her name. And when they do, when they learn who she was and where she came from and what dreams brought her to this vacant lot in Leimert Park, the case will transform from a puzzle into a tragedy. The morning the city lost its innocence has only just begun. Before we descend deeper into this darkness, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these forgotten chapters of American history deserve to be remembered, if you believe the truth matters even when it is uncomfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps the candle burning, allows us to keep exploring the shadows that history would prefer stayed hidden. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. We are a global archive of the forgotten, the overlooked, the unsolved. Now, let us return to that morning. Let us understand exactly what Betty Bersinger saw, and why what happened in that vacant lot would haunt American consciousness for nearly 8 decades. The lot on Norton Avenue was not chosen at random. It sat in the 3900 block between Coliseum Street and West 39th Street, in a neighborhood that was neither rich nor poor, neither glamorous nor destitute. It was the kind of place where working families saved for down payments on modest homes, where veterans used their GI Bill benefits to build lives that looked like the photographs in Life magazine. The lot itself was one of many scattered throughout Leimert Park. Empty parcels waiting to be developed, covered in dry grass and weeds, bordered by houses that were slowly filling in the gaps. Betty Bersinger had walked past this lot before. She knew the neighborhood, knew the rhythms of the street, knew which houses had dogs and which had children playing in the yards. On this particular morning, she was walking south on Norton Avenue, holding her daughter's hand, thinking about ordinary things. The shoes that needed repair, the errands still to run, the dinner she would cook that evening. The morning was cold but not unpleasant, the kind of California winter day that residents of snowbound cities dream about. When she first noticed the shape in the grass, her mind did what minds do when confronted with the impossible. It found a rational explanation. A mannequin, she thought. Someone has dumped a store mannequin in the lot. It made sense. Department stores were always updating their displays, and vacant lots throughout Los Angeles served as unofficial dumping grounds for unwanted furniture, broken appliances, discarded dreams. She was curious, but not alarmed. drawn toward the object by the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at accidents on the highway. She moved closer, perhaps 15 feet from the sidewalk, into the lot itself. Her daughter walked beside her, innocent of what was about to unfold. The shape became clearer. It was lying in the grass, pale against the brown earth, positioned with a strange formality that seemed deliberate. The arms were extended above the head, the legs slightly spread, the body arranged as if for display. And then Betty's mind registered what her eyes were showing her, and the rational explanation shattered. This was not a mannequin. This was a woman, and she had been destroyed. The body was severed completely at the waist, not torn or hacked, but cut with surgical precision, the two halves separated by several inches of empty space. The skin was white, not the white of pale complexion, but the white of marble, of wax, of something drained and lifeless. There was no blood, not on the grass, not pooling beneath the body, not staining the pale skin. Whoever had done this had cleaned her, scrubbed her, washed away every trace of the violence that had created this tableau. Betty Bersinger did not approach any closer. She did not need to. Even from where she stood, she could see enough to understand that this was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was something else entirely. Something calculated and methodical. Something that required time and privacy and a mind capable of transforming a human being into an object. She grabbed her daughter's hand and ran. Not to the nearest house, but to a house she knew, where she knew the people, where she could find safety in the familiar. When the police arrived minutes later, they found what Betty had described. But seeing it themselves, standing over it, trying to process what they were looking at, was something different. Detective Harry Hansen had worked homicide for years. He had seen stabbings and shootings, strangulations and beatings, the full catalog of ways human beings destroy each other. But this was outside his experience, outside anything the Los Angeles Police Department had encountered. The woman lay in a patch of dead grass approximately 10 feet from the sidewalk. Her body had been positioned with careful attention to symmetry. The upper half and lower half aligned as if still connected, the arms raised in a pose that suggested surrender or prayer. The face was turned slightly upward, the eyes closed, the expression almost peaceful except for one detail that transformed everything. Her mouth had been cut at the corners, the wounds extending nearly to her ears, creating a grotesque smile that would haunt every detective who saw it. But it was not just the bisection or the carved smile that made this crime scene extraordinary. It was the totality of what had been done, the completeness of the transformation from person to display. The body bore rope marks on the wrists and ankles, suggesting she had been bound for an extended period. There were lacerations on the torso, cuts that seemed almost decorative, arranged in patterns that hinted at ritual or symbol, and everywhere, the overwhelming sense of control. Nothing about this scene suggested frenzy or panic. This was the work of someone who had taken their time. The coroner's examination would later reveal details that made the crime even more disturbing. The body had been drained of blood through the femoral arteries, a process that required both knowledge and access to a location where such work could be done without interruption. The bisection had been performed with a blade sharp enough and steady enough to cut through flesh and spine without splintering bone. The face and body had been scrubbed with a solution that removed all trace evidence. No fibers, no hairs, no fingerprints of the killer. This was not the work of a spontaneous killer caught in a moment of rage. This was someone who understood anatomy, who had planned carefully, who had thought about how to destroy evidence before committing the crime. As word of the discovery spread, the vacant lot became a focal point for a city hungry for sensation. By afternoon, hundreds of people crowded the sidewalks, craning for a glimpse of the crime scene, pressing against the police barriers, asking questions that officers could not answer. Photographers from newspapers and newsreels captured images that would appear in evening editions and morning papers, images that would be seen by millions of Americans who could not look away from this perfect storm of beauty and horror, innocence and violence. What made this crime scene different from the thousands of murders that occurred in Los Angeles each year? Why did this particular body in this particular vacant lot become an obsession? Part of the answer lies in the victim herself. Young, beautiful, aspirational. But part of it lies in the crime. This was not a murder that could be explained by jealousy or robbery or self-defense. This was murder as art, as statement, as something that spoke to deeper fears about what human beings are capable of when the masks come off. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue became sacred ground in a perverse way. A place where the illusion of safety was shattered, where the promise of Los Angeles as a city of sunshine and opportunity revealed its shadow. For decades afterward, people would visit the spot, standing where Betty Bersinger stood, trying to imagine what it must have been like to see what she saw. The houses nearby would change hands repeatedly, their addresses forever associated with the morning when innocence died, and something darker took its place. Detective Hansen stood in the lot long after the body had been removed, looking at the flattened grass where she had lain, trying to understand what kind of mind could conceive of such a thing. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know her story. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had done this was still out there, walking the streets of Los Angeles, perhaps already planning their next performance. The discovery in the vacant lot was not an ending. It was a beginning. The first chapter in a story that would consume the city and remain unfinished for generations to come. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Short. Remember that name, because in death she would be robbed of it, reduced to a nickname she never knew, transformed into a symbol that obscured the person she actually was. She was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters in a family that understood struggle intimately. Her father, Cleo Short, built miniature golf courses during the brief boom when America became obsessed with the game. He made money, enough to move the family to a comfortable home in Medford, to give his daughters a taste of middle-class stability. But then came 1929, and the crash that followed, and suddenly the miniature golf courses were empty and the money was gone. In 1930, when Elizabeth was just 6 years old, her father's car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge, his clothing folded neatly inside. The implication was clear. Cleo Short had jumped, choosing death over the shame of financial ruin. Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's mother, was left to raise 5 daughters alone during the worst years of the Depression. She took whatever work she could find, bookkeeping, clerking, anything that would put food on the table. The family moved from Medford to a smaller apartment, then to an even smaller one, each move a step down the economic ladder. Elizabeth learned early what it meant to be poor in America, to watch through windows at lives you could never afford, to understand that beauty and charm were currencies when you had no money. She was a sickly child, suffering from severe asthma that made New England winters unbearable. The cold air would close her lungs, leave her gasping for breath, confined to bed while her sisters played outside. Doctors recommended a warmer climate, and in the winter of 1943, when Elizabeth was 18, she made her first trip to Florida, staying with relatives, breathing air that did not hurt, It was during this trip that she began to understand something about herself. She did not want to return to Massachusetts, to the cold and the poverty and the life that seemed already written for her. Elizabeth was beautiful, and she knew it. Dark hair that fell in waves, pale skin that photographed luminously, blue eyes that held a sadness even when she smiled. Men noticed her, followed her with their eyes, offered her attention that felt like currency. She learned to move through the world using her appearance as armor and weapon, as the one asset that could not be taken away by economic collapse or family tragedy. But beauty in 1943 America was both power and danger, especially for a young woman with no money and no protections. She moved to California in 1943, drawn by the same magnetic pull that attracted thousands of young women to the film capital of the world. Hollywood in the war years was booming. The studios were producing films at a breakneck pace, feeding a nation desperate for escape from the daily toll of casualties and rationing. Every diner, every drugstore, every street corner seemed to hold another young woman who believed that tomorrow might be the day a talent scout noticed her. That one lucky break could transform everything. Elizabeth worked briefly at Camp Cook, an army base near Santa Barbara, serving food to soldiers who were training for deployment to the Pacific. It was there that her fingerprints were taken, a routine security measure for anyone working on a military installation. Those fingerprints would eventually identify her body in the vacant lot. But in 1943, they were simply bureaucratic procedure, filed away and forgotten. She met soldiers who promised to write, who gave her their addresses and photos, who vanished into the war and sometimes never returned. She called herself Beth, not Elizabeth, which sounded too formal, too much like her mother. Just Beth. Simple, approachable, the name of a girl you might meet at a soda fountain or a movie theater. She moved from apartment to apartment, staying with friends or acquaintances, never settling anywhere for long. The pattern of her life became one of constant motion, of relationships that lasted weeks or months before, dissolving, of jobs that never quite worked out. She told people she was an actress, that she was waiting for her big break, but the truth was more complicated. Hollywood did not want Elizabeth Short. The studios had their contract players, their carefully groomed starlets who had been selected and shaped according to precise specifications. Elizabeth had beauty, but no connections, charm, but no training, ambition, but no clear path forward. She went to auditions when she heard about them, posed for photographers who promised to help her career, waited in offices where secretaries looked through her as if she did not exist. The Dream Factory had no use for another dark-haired girl with sad eyes and no agent. But she did not give up. Something in her could not accept the idea of returning to Massachusetts, of admitting defeat and settling for the life her mother had lived. Marriage to a working man, children, decades of scrimp and save and making do. She had seen something in California that Massachusetts could never offer. A sense of possibility that felt like breathing after years of suffocation. Even when she was broke, even when she was sleeping on couches and borrowing clothes from friends, she believed that tomorrow might be different. People who knew her during those years remembered her as sweet but troubled, charming but distant, always performing some version of herself that never quite felt authentic. She told stories that did not quite add up, about her father being alive in California when he was actually in Massachusetts, about acting roles that never materialized, about romances with soldiers who were sometimes real and sometimes imagined. She was creating a mythology for herself, constructing an identity that was more appealing than the truth. That she was poor, that she was lost, that she was terrified of ending up back where she started. In the months before her death, Elizabeth moved through Los Angeles like a ghost, staying briefly in various apartments and hotels, never quite belonging anywhere. She was seen at nightclubs and bars, always dressed well despite having no money, always accompanied by men who bought her drinks and meals in exchange for her company. This was survival, the calculus that many young women in Hollywood understood. Beauty could be traded for dinner, for a place to sleep, for a few more days before having to make harder decisions. She was last seen alive on January 9th, 1947, leaving the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Witnesses remembered her walking through the lobby, her dark hair styled carefully, her clothing neat and appropriate. She told someone she was going to meet her sister, though her sister was in Massachusetts and had no knowledge of any meeting. Where she went after leaving the Biltmore, what happened in the days between January 9th and January 15th, remains one of the great mysteries of the case. But here is what we know for certain. Elizabeth Ann Short was a real person. She had dreams and fears, memories and hopes, a past that shaped her and a future she would never reach. She was not the Black Dahlia when she walked out of the Biltmore Hotel. She was Beth, a 22-year-old woman trying to survive in a city that promised everything and delivered nothing. The name Black Dahlia would be given to her by newspaper reporters who knew that a catchy nickname sold, papers who understood that mystery and sex and violence combined to create the perfect story. To understand what happened to her, to understand the magnitude of what was taken, you must first see her as she was. Not a symbol, not a cautionary tale, not a film noir fantasy, but a young woman who wanted what so many young women wanted: to be seen, to matter, to escape the limitations of her birth and become something larger. Her tragedy was not that she failed to achieve stardom. Her tragedy was that she became famous only in death, remembered not for who she was, but for what was done to her. The girl who left Massachusetts because she could not breathe in the cold. The daughter who invented stories about her father to avoid admitting he had abandoned the family. The woman who believed that beauty and charm could be enough to survive in Hollywood. She deserved better than the vacant lot on Norton Avenue. She deserved better than the nickname that would erase her name. She deserved to grow old, to find whatever happiness she was seeking, to live beyond the age of 22. But Los Angeles in 1947 had other plans. The Los Angeles Police Department launched what would become the largest investigation in the city's history. More than 250 officers were assigned to the case, working around the clock in shifts that blurred days into weeks. They conducted over 10,000 interviews, followed up on 1,500 leads, and compiled files that eventually filled an entire room at Central Division headquarters. And yet, for all this effort, for all the man-hours and resources poured into finding Elizabeth Short's killer, the investigation would fail in ways both spectacular and instructive. The fingerprint identification came through on January 16th, the day after the body was discovered. Elizabeth Ann Short, last known address somewhere in Southern California, previous employment at Camp Cook. The name meant nothing to the detectives at first. She had no criminal record, no history with law enforcement beyond the routine fingerprinting at the Army base. But within hours, they began piecing together her movements in the months before her death. And what they found was a portrait of a young woman who existed at the margins, who left few traces, who moved through Los Angeles like smoke. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown became the public faces of the investigation. They were seasoned homicide detectives, men who had worked dozens of murder cases, who understood the rhythms of criminal behavior and the patterns that usually led to arrests. But the Black Dahlia case, and the newspapers had already given her that name, inspired by a film noir called The Blue Dahlia, was unlike anything in their experience. The level of planning, the surgical precision, the complete absence of physical evidence at the crime scene. These factors suggested a killer who understood police procedure, who had thought carefully about how to avoid detection. The investigation began with the obvious question: where was Elizabeth Short killed? The vacant lot on Norton Avenue was clearly a dump site. There was no blood, no evidence of struggle, nothing to suggest she had died there. The killer had transported her body to the location, arranged it carefully, and vanished without leaving tire tracks or footprints that could be definitively linked to the crime. This meant Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere the killer had access to running water and time, hours, perhaps even days, to do what they did. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles, looking for witnesses who might have seen something suspicious. They interviewed taxi drivers and bus operators, asking if anyone remembered a man transporting something large and heavy on the night of January 14th or the early morning of January 15th. They checked hotels and motels, looking for guests who had checked out suddenly or rooms that showed signs of recent cleaning. They found nothing. Or rather, they found too much. Hundreds of tips that led nowhere. Witnesses who thought they had seen Elizabeth but had actually seen someone else. Leads that consumed days of work before dissolving into dead ends. The media coverage was unlike anything Los Angeles had experienced. The newspapers, the Examiner, the Herald, the Times, competed ferociously for scoops, offering rewards for information, publishing photographs of Elizabeth that made her look like a Hollywood starlet rather than a struggling young woman living on the edge of poverty. The coverage was sensational, lurid, focused on the most gruesome details of her death, while simultaneously romanticizing her life. She became the Black Dahlia, a femme fatale from the movies, rather than Beth Short, a real person with a real history. This media frenzy created enormous pressure on the LAPD to solve the case quickly. The department's reputation was already suffering from accusations of corruption and incompetence. And the Black Dahlia murder became a test of whether they could handle a case of national significance. Chief of Police Clemence Horrell promised a swift resolution, assuring the public that the killer would be caught within days. But days became weeks, and weeks became months, and the promises began to ring hollow. The investigation was hampered by jurisdictional conflicts and internal rivalries. The LAPD was handling the case, but the sheriff's department believed they should have jurisdiction because the body might have been transported through county territory. The district attorney's office wanted control of the investigation to ensure that any prosecution would be successful. These bureaucratic battles consumed energy and resources that should have been focused on finding the killer. Leads were not shared, witnesses were interviewed multiple times by different agencies, and the overall coordination that might have yielded results never materialized. Detectives identified dozens of men who had known Elizabeth in the months before her death. There was Robert Manley, a salesman who had driven her from San Diego to Los Angeles on January 9th, and was possibly the last person to see her alive. He was questioned extensively, given multiple polygraph tests, investigated so thoroughly that his marriage collapsed under the strain. But there was no evidence linking him to the murder, and eventually he was cleared. There was Joseph Gordon Fickling, an Army pilot who had corresponded with Elizabeth and whose photograph was found in her belongings. He was questioned and cleared. There was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who had allowed Elizabeth to stay at his home in the weeks before her death. He became a suspect, was investigated for months, but ultimately no evidence connected him to the crime. The problem was not lack of suspects. It was too many suspects and not enough evidence. Every man who had known Elizabeth, every person who had seen her in the days before her death, became a potential killer in the eyes of investigators. The case files swelled with names and interviews and alibis, but nothing coalesced into a coherent narrative that pointed to a specific individual. The investigation was drowning in information that led nowhere. And then there were the physical clues that tantalized, but ultimately revealed nothing. On January 24th, 9 days after the body was discovered, a package arrived at the Examiner newspaper. Inside was Elizabeth Short's Social Security card, her birth certificate, photographs of her with various men, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The items had been cleaned with gasoline, an attempt to remove fingerprints that was largely successful. A note made from letters cut from newspapers read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The promised letter never arrived, or if it did, it was lost among the hundreds of crank letters that poured into police headquarters and newspaper offices. The package was analyzed, the photographs studied, the address book combed for leads. Detectives tracked down and interviewed everyone listed in the address book. But again, nothing connected any of them definitively to the murder. The package seemed designed to taunt investigators, to demonstrate that the killer was following the case in the media, that he was playing a game the police could not win. Forensic analysis of Elizabeth's body provided details about the murder, but not about the murderer. The autopsy revealed that she had been struck on the head repeatedly, that she had ligature marks suggesting prolonged restraint, that she had been alive when some of the torture was inflicted. The bisection of her body had been performed after death, accomplished with a knife or surgical blade, requiring both strength and anatomical knowledge. The blood had been drained methodically, and the body had been scrubbed clean with a precision that suggested medical or mortuary experience. This led investigators to focus on suspects with medical backgrounds. Doctors, medical students, morticians, anyone who might have the knowledge and tools to accomplish what had been done to Elizabeth Short. They interviewed hundreds of men with medical training, investigated their whereabouts on the relevant dates, looked for any connection to the victim. But the medical community in Los Angeles was large, and proving that someone had both the knowledge and the opportunity was nearly impossible without physical evidence. By spring of 1947, the investigation was faltering. The initial wave of publicity had generated thousands of tips. But as the case remained unsolved, public interest began to wane. Other murders occurred, other stories captured headlines, and the Black Dahlia gradually receded from the front pages. Detectives continued working the case, but with less intensity, less hope of a breakthrough. The file remained open, but the active investigation was quietly scaled back. What happened? How did the largest investigation in Los Angeles history fail to produce an arrest? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors. A killer who planned carefully and left no physical evidence. A victim whose transient lifestyle made it difficult to establish firm timelines. A media environment that contaminated the investigation with sensationalism. And a police department that was overwhelmed, under-resourced, and riddled with internal conflicts. The Black Dahlia case revealed the limitations of mid-century police work. The challenges of solving a murder when the killer understands forensics and takes precautions. The investigation did not end in 1947. It continues, in a sense, even today. With amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts poring over the files, proposing new theories, convinced they have found the answer that eluded the LAPD. But the official investigation, the one that might have led to justice for Elizabeth Short, effectively ended within months of her death. The killer had won, not through brilliance necessarily, but through patience and planning and an understanding that in a city as large and chaotic as post-war Los Angeles, it was possible to commit the perfect murder and simply walk away. Within days of Elizabeth Short's body being discovered, something strange began happening at police headquarters. People started confessing. Not one or two individuals seeking attention, but dozens, eventually more than 60, each claiming to be the killer, each offering details about how they had murdered the Black Dahlia. Some walked into police stations voluntarily, their faces solemn with the weight of their supposed guilt. Others called from payphones, their voices trembling as they described what they claimed to have done. A few sent letters, written in careful script or angry scrawls, providing addresses where police could come and arrest them. This phenomenon, the false confession, is one of the darkest peculiarities of high-profile murder cases. It reveals something unsettling about human psychology, about the hunger for significance that drives people to claim credit for atrocities they did not commit. To understand the Black Dahlia case, to understand why it remains unsolved, you must first understand how these false confessions consumed investigative resources, created false leads, and ultimately helped the real killer remain free. The first confession came within 48 hours of the body's discovery. A man walked into a police station in downtown Los Angeles and announced that he had killed Elizabeth Short. He provided details: where he had picked her up, what they had argued about, how he had lost control. Detectives listened, took notes, began checking his story against the known facts. Within hours, his alibi was confirmed by multiple witnesses, and his supposed details about the crime were revealed to be information he had read in newspaper accounts. He was released, but he would not be the last. Why do people confess to crimes they did not commit? The psychology is complex, rooted in needs that most people never acknowledge even to themselves. For some, it is a desperate bid for attention in a world that has rendered them invisible. These are people who have lived entire lives without being noticed, without mattering, and suddenly they see an opportunity to become significant, even if that significance comes through association with horror. A false confession transforms them from nobody into somebody, at least for a few hours or days. For others, the motivation is darker and more disturbed. There are individuals who fantasize about committing murder but lack the capacity or courage to actually do it. When a high-profile case emerges, they can vicariously experience the act by claiming responsibility, inserting themselves into a narrative of violence and control. Their confession is a form of fantasy fulfillment, a way to inhabit the identity of a killer without having to commit the act itself. And then there are those suffering from genuine mental illness, people whose grip on reality is so tenuous that they genuinely come to believe they committed crimes they only read about. The line between their internal world and external reality blurs, and memories of newspaper accounts become confused with memories of actions. These individuals are the most tragic of the false confessors, not seeking attention or living out fantasies, but genuinely lost in minds that can no longer distinguish truth from delusion. The LAPD was forced to investigate each confession, no matter how implausible. Protocol demanded it. Any one of these confessors might be the actual killer, and dismissing a confession without investigation could mean letting a murderer walk free. But the process was exhausting and consuming. Each confession required detectives to conduct interviews, verify alibis, check the confessor's story against the physical evidence. Hours and days were spent chasing leads that investigators often suspected were false from the beginning. One of the most elaborate false confessions came from a woman named Leslie Dillon. Actually, Dillon was a man, a former mortician's assistant who contacted the police through an intermediary, claiming to have knowledge about the killer. He did not initially confess to the crime himself, but suggested that a friend of his, a man he called Jeff Connors, might be responsible. Detectives investigated and discovered that Jeff Connors did not exist. He was an invention of Dylan's imagination. When confronted, Dylan's story changed repeatedly, adding details and retracting them, creating a labyrinth of claims that took months to untangle. Dylan became a prime suspect for a time. His background in mortuary work gave him anatomical knowledge, and his obsessive interest in the case suggested a deeper involvement. He was held and questioned extensively, but ultimately there was no physical evidence linking him to Elizabeth Short, and his constantly shifting story undermined his credibility. He was released, but the Dylan investigation consumed countless hours of detective work and created friction between different law enforcement agencies who disagreed about his guilt or innocence. Another confessor, a man named Daniel Voorhees, claimed that he had been given a vision by God, revealing that he was the killer. He walked into a police station in tears, convinced of his own guilt despite having no memory of the actual crime. He believed that he had murdered Elizabeth Short while in some kind of fugue state, that God was now punishing him with knowledge of what he had done. Detectives quickly established that Voorhees had been in another state when Elizabeth was killed. But his genuine distress was disturbing. Here was a man so desperate to explain his own psychological suffering that he was willing to accept responsibility for murder. The newspapers eagerly reported on these confessions, treating each one as a potential breakthrough in the case. Headlines announced that the killer had been caught, only to retract the claims days later when alibis were confirmed. This cycle of accusation and retraction became part of the Black Dahlia story, contributing to the sense that the case was unsolvable, that the truth was buried beneath layers of false information and attention-seeking behavior. But not all the confessors were harmless fantasists or mentally ill individuals. Some were dangerous in their own right, men with histories of violence who seized on the Black Dahlia case as an opportunity to relive or confess to other crimes. During the investigation of these false confessors, police discovered and solved several unrelated murders and assaults. In a perverse way, the Black Dahlia case became a magnet for violent criminals seeking attention, and the investigation became a clearinghouse for solving other crimes. The most disturbing aspect of the false confessions was not their number, but their detail. Some confessors provided information that had not been publicly released, suggesting either that they had inside knowledge or that they had access to investigative details through leaks in the department. This created paranoia among investigators. Was someone on the force feeding information to false confessors, either deliberately or through careless talk? The possibility that the investigation itself was compromised added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible case. As years passed, the confessions continued. In the 1950s, a man confessed on his deathbed, claiming he had carried the guilt for years and wanted to die with a clean conscience. His confession was investigated and found to be false. He had been in another city when Elizabeth was killed. In the 1970s, another deathbed confession emerged, and again, it proved baseless. The Black Dahlia case had taken on a life of its own, becoming a cultural touchstone that people on the edge of death felt compelled to claim as their own. Each false confession represented time and resources diverted from the real investigation. Each one created hope that the case might finally be solved, followed by disappointment when the confession fell apart. And each one made it more difficult for investigators to maintain focus, to distinguish signal from noise in the overwhelming flood of false information. If the real killer had confessed, would investigators have even recognized the truth among so many lies? The psychology of false confession reveals something uncomfortable about human and our relationship to famous crimes. These cases become myths, stories that exist in the public imagination, with a power that transcends the actual facts. People want to be part of the myth, to insert themselves into the narrative, to transform from spectator to participant. The Black Dahlia was no longer just Elizabeth Short, a murdered woman. She had become a symbol, an icon, and claiming responsibility for her death was a way of claiming significance in a culture that worships notoriety. 60 confessions, 60 different stories about how Elizabeth Short died, where she was killed, what motivated her murder. 60 voices claiming guilt, each one a distraction from the truth. Each one a reminder that some murders capture the public imagination so completely that they stop being about the victim and become about everyone who projects their own darkness onto the crime. Somewhere among those 60 voices, or perhaps never speaking at all, was the one person who actually knew what happened. The killer who understood that silence was safer than confession. That in a case flooded with false claims, the truth could remain hidden simply by never being spoken. Who killed Elizabeth Short? In the 79 years since her body was discovered in that vacant lot, this question has generated hundreds of theories, dozens of books, and countless hours of amateur investigation. Some theories are plausible, built on circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. Others are fantastical, constructed from wishful thinking and confirmation bias. But all of them share one characteristic. None has ever been proven beyond reasonable doubt. We descend now into the shadowland of speculation, where facts blur into possibilities and every answer raises new questions. The most persistent theory, the one that has captured imaginations for decades, centers on a man named George Hodel. Dr. George Hill Hodel was a Los Angeles physician, a surgeon with the anatomical knowledge and access to private facilities that the crime seemed to require. He was brilliant, wealthy, connected to Los Angeles high society, and by all accounts, deeply disturbed. He hosted parties at his mansion where artists and intellectuals mingled with criminals and prostitutes. He collected art that explored themes of violence and sexuality. And according to his own son, Steve Hodel, who would later become an LAPD detective, he was the Black Dahlia killer. Steve Hodel's theory emerged decades after the murder, after his father's death, when he began investigating George Hodel's past and discovered connections that seemed too significant to ignore. George Hodel had known Man Ray, the surrealist photographer, and some of Man Ray's photographs bore striking resemblance to the positioning of Elizabeth Short's body. George Hodel had been investigated in the 1940s for other crimes, including accusations of molesting his own daughter. And in 1950, Los Angeles police had placed listening devices in George Hodel's home as part of an investigation. And on those recordings, George allegedly made statements that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt. The evidence Steve Hodel compiled is circumstantial but compelling. George Hodel had the medical knowledge to perform the bisection with surgical precision. He had access to private locations where such work could be done without interruption. He had a documented history of sadistic behavior and sexual violence. And he fled Los Angeles in 1950, eventually settling in Asia, as if running from something that could not be outrun. But circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, is not proof. George Hodel was never charged, never tried, never convicted. The theory remains exactly that, a theory. Another line of investigation focuses on the possibility that Elizabeth Short was killed by a serial offender, someone for whom she was not the first victim and likely not the last. The level of control demonstrated in the crime, the ritualistic elements of the body's positioning, the absence of rage or frenzy. These characteristics often appear in serial murders. Some researchers have attempted to link the Black Dahlia killing to other unsolved murders in California during the 1940s, looking for patterns in methodology or victim selection. There was the murder of Jean French, whose body was found in Los Angeles just weeks after Elizabeth Short's. Her corpse also displaying signs of torture and positioned deliberately. There was Georgette Bauerdorf, a socialite murdered in 1944, her death involving similar elements of control and staging. Some investigators believe these crimes were connected, that a single killer was operating in Los Angeles during the 1940s, selecting young women and transforming their deaths into performances. But the evidence linking these cases is tenuous. Similarities in methodology do not prove a common perpetrator, and the LAPD never officially connected them. A darker theory, one that speaks to the corruption and darkness beneath Hollywood's glamorous surface, suggests that Elizabeth Short was killed by someone connected to the entertainment industry, perhaps as punishment for knowing too much or threatening to expose secrets. In 1947, Hollywood was controlled by a handful of powerful studios, and those studios protected their interests ruthlessly. Scandals were buried, witnesses were paid off or intimidated, and people who threatened the system had a way of disappearing or meeting unfortunate ends. Could Elizabeth Short have been involved with someone powerful? Someone whose reputation or career would be destroyed if their association became public? Could she have been pregnant, threatening to name the father and demand support? The theory is appealing because it explains the calculated of the crime. This was not a crime of passion, but a crime of elimination, designed to send a message while eliminating a problem. But, again, there is no concrete evidence. Elizabeth Short's associations in the months before her death were primarily with working-class men, soldiers, and salesmen, not Hollywood moguls or studio executives. Some theories venture into even darker territory, suggesting connections to organized crime. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a battleground for competing criminal organizations, with figures like Mickey Cohen and Bugsy Siegel controlling vice operations throughout the city. Could Elizabeth Short have become entangled with these operations? Perhaps as a prostitute or a witness to criminal activity? The surgical precision of her murder, the complete absence of evidence, the sense that the crime was committed by someone with resources and connections. These elements could point to a professional killing, a message sent to others who might consider betraying the organization. But this theory also struggles with the crime itself. Organized crime killings in the 1940s were typically efficient. A bullet to the head, a body dumped in a remote location, nothing elaborate or time-consuming. The Black Dahlia murder was the opposite of efficient. It required hours, perhaps days, of work. It was personal in its brutality, obsessive in its attention to detail. This was not the work of a hired killer eliminating a problem. This was the work of someone for whom the killing itself was the point. Then there are the theories that focus on suspects who were investigated at the time but never charged. Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner who allowed Elizabeth to stay in his home, remained under suspicion for years. He had the means and opportunity, and some investigators believed he had motive. Perhaps Elizabeth had rejected his advances or threatened to expose him. But no evidence ever emerged linking him definitively to the crime, and he maintained his innocence until his death. Robert Manley, the married salesman who drove Elizabeth from San Diego to Los Angeles and was possibly the last person to see her alive, was investigated so thoroughly that his life fell apart under the scrutiny. He passed multiple polygraph tests, his alibi was confirmed, and investigators eventually cleared him. But some amateur detectives continue to believe he was involved, pointing to inconsistencies in his statements and his nervous demeanor during questioning. The problem is that nervous behavior and inconsistent statements are common among innocent people being questioned about a notorious murder. The stress of investigation can make anyone appear guilty. What all these theories share is a fundamental problem. They are built on fragments, on possibilities, on connections that seem meaningful until examined closely. The Black Dahlia case has become a Rorschach test, where investigators and amateur sleuths project their own assumptions about human and criminal behavior onto an incomplete picture. We see what we want to see. A Hollywood conspiracy, a serial killer, a crime of passion, a professional hit. Because the truth is hidden beneath layers of time and lost evidence. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is the simplest: that Elizabeth Short was killed by someone random. Someone who encountered her by chance during those missing days between January 9th and January 15th. A predator who saw an opportunity and seized it, who had the intelligence and self-control to avoid leaving evidence, who committed this one horrific crime and then returned to a normal life, carrying the secret until death. This theory offers no satisfaction, no sense of meaning or pattern. It suggests that Elizabeth Short's murder was simply bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. We want murders to make sense, to fit into narratives that confirm our understanding of how the world works. We want killers to be monsters we can recognize, patterns we can detect, mysteries we can solve through careful investigation and logical deduction. But sometimes the truth is that chaos exists, that evil can be random and unsolvable, that some secrets are kept simply because no one asks the right questions at the right time. The Black Dahlia case may remain unsolved, not because the killer was brilliant, but because he was lucky and careful and ultimately forgettable. Someone who committed an unforgettable crime and then disappeared into the anonymity of everyday life. 79 years have passed since Betty Bersinger found Elizabeth Short's body in that vacant lot. The houses on Norton Avenue have changed hands countless times. The neighborhood has transformed, and the empty lot where she lay has long since been developed into someone's home. But the case itself has not faded. If anything, it has grown stronger, more mythic, more resistant to the passage of time. The Black Dahlia is no longer just an unsolved murder. It has become something larger, a story that reveals truths about America that we would prefer not to acknowledge. To understand why this case endures, why it continues to fascinate generations who were not yet born when Elizabeth Short died, you must first understand the moment in history when it occurred. January 1947 was a threshold moment for America. The uneasy transition between the certainties of war and the ambiguities of peace. For 4 years, the nation had united against a clear enemy, had sacrificed, suffered with a sense of purpose. But now the war was over, and the soldiers had come home to find a country they no longer recognized, transformed by industrial expansion and mass migration and social upheaval. Los Angeles embodied this transformation more completely than any other American city. In 1940, the population was approximately 1.5 million. By 1947, it had nearly doubled, swollen with defense workers and veterans and dreamers drawn by the promise of jobs and sunshine and new beginnings. The infrastructure could not keep pace. Housing shortages, inadequate police services, neighborhoods springing up overnight without the social bonds that create community. The city was coming apart even as it was being built, fragmenting into isolated individuals who knew nothing about their neighbors and cared less. And at the center of this chaotic expansion sat Hollywood, the dream factory that manufactured illusions for a global audience. The movies of 1947 presented a vision of America that was optimistic and idealized. Handsome heroes, virtuous women, problems that could be solved in 90 minutes with courage and determination. But beneath this glossy surface, a different kind of film was emerging, one that would come to define the era. Film noir. These were movies about betrayal and moral ambiguity, about cities where darkness pooled in every corner, about beautiful women who were either victims or predators, and sometimes both. The Black Dahlia case was film noir made real. It had every element the genre required. A beautiful woman with a mysterious past, a crime that spoke of corruption and perversity, a cast of suspects who all had secrets to hide, and an investigation that revealed more questions than answers. The newspapers understood this instinctively, which is why they gave Elizabeth Short that nickname. The Black Dahlia, a name borrowed directly from a noir film. They were not just reporting a murder, they were creating a narrative that fit the cultural moment, a story about glamour and darkness existing in the same space. But what the newspapers did, what all the subsequent books and films and investigations have done, was transform Elizabeth Short from a person into a symbol. She became the embodied warning about what happens to young women who come to Hollywood seeking stardom. She became proof that beneath the sunshine and palm trees, Los Angeles was a predatory landscape where innocence was currency and beauty made you a target. Every young woman who stepped off a bus at Union Station, suitcase in hand and dreams in her eyes, could look at Elizabeth Short's story and see a cautionary tale about ambition without protection, about desire without resources. This transformation from person to symbol is itself a kind of violence, a second death that erases the complexity of who Elizabeth Short actually was. We know the mythology, the aspiring actress, the woman in black, the beauty destroyed by Hollywood's darkness. But we know very little about Beth, the actual person. What did she think about in those final days? What hopes sustained her when she had no money and no place to stay? What dreams kept her from giving up and returning to Massachusetts? These questions have no answers because they do not fit the myth we have constructed around her death. The case endures because it taps into fundamental anxieties about American life. The fear that success requires moral compromise. The suspicion that power protects its own interests at any cost. The knowledge that violence often goes unpunished. That the innocent suffer while the guilty walk free. Elizabeth Short's murder is not just about one woman killed by one man. It is about systemic failures, about a society that creates conditions where young women are disposable, where poverty forces terrible choices, where justice is available only to those with money and connections. Consider what we know about Elizabeth Short's final months. She had no stable housing, no reliable income, no safety net. She survived by trading beauty and companionship for meals and shelter, moving from couch to couch, from man to man, always one bad decision away from catastrophe. This is not Hollywood's fault specifically. This is America's fault. A society that promised opportunity, but delivered only exploitation for those without resources. Elizabeth Short came to California seeking a better life and found instead a trap that closed slowly until escape became impossible. The Hollywood of 1947 created an ecosystem where thousands of young women competed for a handful of roles, where studio executives held absolute power over careers and lives, where the gap between success and failure was determined by factors that had nothing to do with talent or determination. The dream factory required an endless supply of dreamers to keep functioning. But it could only elevate a tiny fraction, while the rest struggled and failed and sometimes disappeared. Elizabeth Short was not unique in her struggles. She was typical. What made her different was how she died and how her death was discovered and publicized. We tell ourselves that we care about solving the Black Dahlia case because we want justice for Elizabeth Short. But perhaps the truth is more complicated and less flattering. Perhaps we are fascinated by the case because it allows us to explore darkness at a safe distance, to indulge in morbid curiosity while maintaining moral superiority. We can read about the crime, study the photographs, debate the theories, all while telling ourselves we are honoring her memory. But honoring her memory would mean acknowledging the conditions that made her vulnerable, would mean addressing the systems that continue to exploit and endanger young women today. The case remains unsolved, not because the killer was brilliant, but because the investigation occurred in a specific historical moment when forensic was primitive, when police departments were overwhelmed and corrupt, when media sensationalism contaminated evidence and created false leads. If Elizabeth Short had been killed today, with DNA, analysis and digital surveillance and coordinated law enforcement databases, her killer would likely have been caught, but she was killed in 1947. And in 1947 Los Angeles, it was possible to commit the perfect murder if you were careful and lucky. 79 years later, the killer is certainly dead. Whether he lived his remaining years haunted by what he had done or whether he slept peacefully every night, confident that his secret was safe, we will never know. Perhaps he confessed on his deathbed to someone who kept the secret. Perhaps he told no one, carrying the knowledge alone until it died with him. Perhaps he committed other crimes, emboldened by getting away with this one. Or perhaps the Black Dahlia was his only victim, an aberration in an otherwise ordinary life, a moment of darkness that he spent decades trying to forget. The legacy of the Black Dahlia case is not just the unsolved mystery. It is what the mystery reveals about us. It shows how easily we transform real people into legends, how readily we consume tragedy as entertainment, how persistently we seek patterns and meaning, even when chaos and randomness might be the only truth. Elizabeth Short deserved better than to become the Black Dahlia. She deserved to grow old, to find whatever happiness she was seeking, to be remembered as a person rather than a cautionary tale. But history had other plans, and now she exists forever as she was on January 15th, 1947. 22 years old, frozen in time. The girl who came to Hollywood and found only darkness. The story has not ended. It is still being told every time someone discovers the case for the first time. Every time an amateur detective proposes a new theory. Every time a young woman steps off a bus in Los Angeles with dreams of stardom and nothing else. The Black Dahlia case is eternal because it speaks to fears and fascinations that are eternal. The darkness beneath beauty, the violence hiding behind civilization's mask, the terrible price that some people pay for other people's dreams. If you found value in this exploration of America's most haunting unsolved murder, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. Why do you think this case continues to fascinate us nearly 8 decades later? What does our obsession with the Black Dahlia reveal about our culture? And where are you watching from as we conclude this journey into Hollywood's darkest chapter? Until next time, may the truth find light in the darkness, and may Elizabeth Ann Short finally rest in peace.